Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Mike Gomez, and I am the director of New York University Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. And we are delighted to have a panel this afternoon to discuss the work of Dr. Maribel Morey, who wrote an important book, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporations, an American Dilemma in the Making of a White World Order, published in 2021 by UNC Press. This is a part of an ongoing series of conversations that the center hosts throughout the academic year. And we are coming to the end of the spring semester. So this, I think, may be our last live webinar. I could be wrong about that. I want to thank Ms. Charisse Taylor, the administrator for the center, for organizing everything. And at this point, I want to introduce the principal interlocutor who will engage the author on the work. And that is none other than Professor Carina E, who is the H. Copeland Chair of Social Sciences and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Brandeis University. There, she also serves as Director of Faculty Mentoring, a scholar of race and sexuality, comparative colonialisms and nationalisms, migration and maritime history, print cultures, bodily aesthetics, and the relationship between race, ethnicity, and political power. Professor Ray's research focuses on Ghana and its diasporas, while also branching out to include a long-term oral history project documenting the experiences of Cubans who served in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. She is the author of Crossing the Color Line, Race, Sex, and the Contested Politics of Colonialism in Ghana, the winner of the American Historical Association's 2016 Wesley Logan Book Prize and the African Studies Association's 2017 Aidoo Snyder Book Prize. Her work has also appeared in Gender and History, PMLA, American Historical Review, and the Journal of West African History, among other journals. She is the series editor or co-editor of New African Histories and Ohio's Short Histories of Africa, Ohio University Press, and African Identities, Cambridge University Press. And recently she completed a 3-year term as editor of Ghana Studies and as a member of the Board of Editors for the American Historical Review. Professor Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I appreciate it. And I also want to extend my thanks to Charisse Taylor for organizing us all here. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Maribel Morey, the author of the book we are all here today to discuss, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporations, An American Dilemma and the Making of a White World Order. Published by University of North Carolina Press in November 2021. Morey has written widely in a range of other peer-reviewed venues, including Humanity, Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and Reviews in American History. Her public scholarship has appeared in HistPhil, a blog on the history of philanthropy that she co-founded and co-edits, Items, The Atlantic Online, and the Miami Institute, among others. She received her PhD in history from Princeton University, a JD from NYU Law School, and a BA from the University of Notre Dame. Morey is founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, which describes itself as a nonprofit organization centering the work of global majority scholars in the social sciences as a means both for improving the integrity and rigor of these fields and for building more inclusive national and international political economies. Welcome, Maribel. So I'd like to start right where I left off with the Miami Institute for Social Sciences and ask you to tell us a little bit about the Institute and its relationship to both the social sciences and to the world of philanthropic foundations, since it is manifestly evident that the work you are doing now is in many ways a response to, and perhaps even a repudiation of, the history you tell in white philanthropy, while also being adjacent to it. And as you tell us about that, I hope that you might root your response a bit in your own personal biography, since it also seems clear that both the book and your current work are rooted in and animated by your own history. Maribel.
Dr. Ray, thank you so very much for engaging with the book, and that first question is amazing. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for the invitation to be part of this forum. And thank you very much, Cherise Taylor, for bringing us all together here as well, making it possible. Dr. Ray, to your first question, yes, okay. You went straight to the core. So I am Cuban American. I was born in Miami. Both of my parents came from Cuba in the 60s. And I grew up in a very Cold War environment where there are only two options in the world. I'm 40, so I was growing up in Miami in the 1980s and 90s. And it was either profit maximizing capitalism or communism. And there was never an in-between. And it seemed to me that both were failed models. I saw suffering from relatives in Cuba and suffering from relatives in Miami. We know the obvious one of shortages and rights infringements in Cuba, but as well in Miami. For example, my grandparents passed away with credit card debt just to access medication and absolute poverty. So I've been invested from a really young age to think beyond these two ping pong options that seem like the only ones available. And then relatedly, I've always been a big reader, and from a young age, thinking that, I couldn't see myself in the books that I read. So in school, they talk about the early Americans and, with the Mayfair, and I'm thinking, well, my early American came from Cuba, just a decade ago. So how do we see ourselves in knowledge that's being produced about ourselves, about our communities? And how do we relatedly belong in the community? And over the years, growing up within the academy, first as an undergraduate, then as a law school student, and then the PhD program, seeing inequities in how knowledge is produced about us. So who gets to define the problems to be solved in these fields that supposedly study all of us human beings? Why are some of us seen as problematic, as Latinos, as Black? Why more criminalized? Why are our identities criminalized? And academics don't have the control over all ideas that circulate in the world, but they do play and have played a central role in shaping ideas about ourselves and each other at the ground level. So over time, realizing that a lot of these gatekeepers are white Anglo-Americans in my research in the early 20th century, but seeing it play out in my own lived experience. So understanding that even where was I supposed to hope to be ultimately in the academy, in elite institutions. And elite institutions, even they had, their problems of, as we know, with the Harvard letter, et cetera, et cetera. We see repeated examples with tenure cases, but just generally, where's our place in the academy as global majority scholars? Can we ask the hard questions? There's so many incentives not to ask those hard questions in seminars, in faculty meetings about our fields, about who's being hired. So over time, wanting to create a space where we could ask those really hard questions. And at some level, it could be seen as naive. Don't ask those hard questions. Just stay quiet, and like keep your job. But I really do believe in the public purpose of knowledge production. What is the purpose of knowledge in the academy if it's not supposed to be a public good? For one, universities really tout themselves in the value of being a nonprofit. They scorn for-profit universities. Well, if it's a nonprofit, it's supposed to be accountable to the public. So this knowledge is supposed to be in dialogue with the public. And if it's a public good, then it should be inclusive. And we should really care about these questions of inclusivity and how problems are being defined in our field, how the data is being collected. So that's the genesis of the Miami Institute, where several of us who found a lot of the same anxieties about the academy and the role that knowledge is playing in shaping our inequitable world, and the potential for it to be a positive element towards a more equitable world, started shaping this institution. And it's bringing people across geographies, across fields, to talk about how we would imagine our fields in a stronger light. And in the process, centering and amplifying the work of global majority scholars across the global South and North, so we can meet each other, learn about each other. And to wrap up how it's connected to the book as well, one of the biggest fears of these early 20th century networks of foundation officials, advisors, and scholars they funded was a rising consciousness, a rising Black consciousness, and especially a rising consciousness. One could, I didn't explicitly state in the book, but amongst the global majority. Like, that's very powerful for global majority people to meet each other, to talk about the issues of white Anglo-American domination. So that's, in a nutshell, the genesis of the Miami Institute. And relatedly, we know that an institute like this is not going to get funding off the bat from key funders of a white Anglo-American world order. So we started out with a mutual aid model, leaning on each other. And we are also looking through a mixed model. So we might have projects that will interest distinct funders, but finding the right funders that really value bringing and amplifying the work of global majority scholars.
Thank you. So for those who haven't read your book, would you briefly lay out its major arguments and who you regard as its primary audiences? Who you're writing for and why? Who are your interlocutors? And what has the response to the book been, and by who?
So I was in a 20-year-old living in Paris, a study abroad in college, and I started reading about feminism. I started really liking Simone de Beauvoir. I still yet did not know about intersectionality, so I separated my identity, race, and sex. So I was really interested in how she did this analogy. And for the race, to expand the race and sex analogy, she leans on this book by a white Swede called An American Dilemma, the book, written by Gunnar Myrdal. And I thought, this is interesting. Why would this, for me, this goddess of intellect at the time, why would she rely on this man? So since I was 20, and I published when I was 40, I've been fixated on this book, An American Dilemma. So I've read it from different lenses. First, as a history of feminism, history of African-American political thought. So I was doing both as an undergraduate, and then to law school, fascinated that someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, would cite An American Dilemma rather than Le Deuxième Sexe by Simone de Beauvoir, when she was trying to analogize race and sex with the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, because she knew the politics of knowledge. She knew that her readers, who were mainly white men and women, would value An American Dilemma more than Le Deuxième Sexe, and specifically men. And he made that analogy in the back of the book. We can talk more about that. The funder asked him to move it from the main manuscript to an appendix. So over the years, I became enthralled, like, why did this book become so central? So really questioning, and it's coming from this place of not assuming that it should have been important, that it should have been revered so much. It's just a book. It's just written by an author. So why did it get to this level? And when I realized that he had been financed by Carnegie Corporation of New York and basically giving a blank check to write this project with as many researchers as he wanted, that got me interested. That's when I started learning about philanthropy. I'm like, wait, what are these organizations? I grew up only understanding the binary of profit maximizing capitalism and communism. Who are these like philanthropists in a capitalist society who are talking about solving social problems and exist in like not making profit? Who are these people? And why are they, from elite institutions? They're not exactly Che Guevara or Fidel Castro. So like, what are they trying to achieve without disturbing capitalism per se? So that became the fascination, understanding these figures behind the scenes. And so I started explaining in the book their motivation for financing this project. And that required me in the archives too, to waste time, to say, okay, possibly, I know I'm trained as a US historian, and we're told to have this exceptionalist narrative of the US that nothing beyond it relates to it. But I'm getting the vibe from these historical actors that they analogized their funding here and what they wanted to fund, for example, in British Africa. So opening the files for their funding in South Africa, for example, and they called it the British Commonwealth Fund. So looking through those files and seeing the echoes of what they were trying to do. So the book explains that this foundation president who ultimately financed An American Dilemma inherited an organization that he started leading in the 1920s, inherited an organization very much shaped by Andrew Carnegie's vision for philanthropy. His interlocutor for that was James Bertram, a personal secretary who became a lifetime member on the board, who said, you know, the organization can work in the US, Canada, and the British colonies. And what Carnegie meant by British colony was not what might be coming out of London as a definition of colony. It's actually communities of whites. And he didn't just mean like a few peppered, you know, white people. He meant areas of the British Empire that could be dominated by white people. For this reason, you don't have to worry about the real legal definition of colony. It could be, you know, like a dominion. So it could, you know, it can include South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, but nothing in West Africa, and yes, East Africa. Oh, and we'll never fund anything in India for the same reason. So he inherits an organization with geographic and substantive focus and working in areas of the British Empire in the US, but so in the Anglo-American world, that would that where white domination existed, and that would privilege the needs of white people. So he even explained too, yes, we can fund education for Black people, but we see that as a problem that we're helping those white people address. And that President Keppel, within that framework, starts financing the social sciences as a tool to help white policymakers in these different parts of the Anglo-American world address problems they perceived in white domination and Black subjection. So I detailed that the first study is a poor white study in South Africa, published in 1932. The second one, an African survey published or run through Chatham House in London, and then an American dilemma in the US. They were all comprehensive studies in the social sciences, bringing teams of people together, though the structure changed over time and what it meant to do collaborative research, and we could talk about that, with an American dilemma most modeling an African survey, both in structure and the sort of methodological approach.
So just, I know I asked you a bunch of questions there, sort of back to back. I want to ask you just a little bit more about your audience.
Oh, yeah.
Because it seems to me, as I've looked at how your book has circulated and who's really taken it up, it's really been taken up in the world of foundations, you know, and it was probably in some ways perfect timing because of a kind of, I would say, more a sort of systemic reckoning around questions of race and racism in America. And you're coming in at a time when I suppose, you know, many different organizations, companies, et cetera, have been in a way forced in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the revival of the movement for Black Lives Again, a kind of need to confront themselves. And so it seems like your book has offered a tool to foundations looking to reckon with some of that history. But I sort of wonder if, in fact, that was the audience that you were writing for, the primary audience. I mean, I think the first part of your answer seems to suggest that in some ways the audience was for readers like yourself. But just to say a little bit more about your intended audiences, plural, were.
So I really hope that foundations take it as an opportunity for self-reflection, but I actually haven't seen that much. Do you see it? Because we can just talk casually, but I did one at Stanford PAC's conversation at the invitation of Lucy Bernholz. So there's been some of that. But it really, and I did do a talk at Chatham House, and I will say something about, how about this? It takes an individual within an organization to say, hey, let's have difficult conversations about philanthropy, because this book really describes characters, historical figures who woke up in the morning, these white Anglo-American men from elite institutions in the Northeast and their advisors in South Africa and London specifically, who woke up and really believed that they were advocating racial equality. They were funding Black institutions. Black grantees at times. But repeatedly, they relied on white advisors. They privileged white Anglo-American domination above all else as like the equilibrium to reach when there's instability in what they saw as peaceful relations, which they assumed was white domination and Black subjection. So those are very difficult conversations to have right now, because I think that a lot of us want to believe we have the answers for equality. But understanding what equality is for ourselves, even for, I would say for me, understanding what it means in my own life as a woman, as a Latina, is actually really hard and a day-to-day process. So defining equality for ourselves is hard. Understanding what it means for our communities is even harder. And a book like this helps us see how difficult, how nuanced, how co-opted it can become. Because this definition of racial equality in the US that Myrdal promulgated in the book, An American Dilemma, we understand it from white philanthropy as part of this history of white domination. So even the way we talk about equality can be co-opted and maintain domination. So I would applaud it. I'm open to it. I would love it. I would say for me, the biggest embrace has been from global majority people and institutions, whether it's universities or, or like think tanks or independent institutions, but it comes down to the individual.
So if to a Black studies audience, the broad outlines of this history aren't particularly surprising, right? That extraordinarily wealthy white men would seek to use their wealth to perpetuate white supremacy. What is it about this history that ought not to be so casually dismissed? In other words, what do we miss about the interventions your book is making when we dismiss your conclusions as obvious?
I think it's fascinating that it's true, it's obvious, right? Like Oliver C. Cox saw it, Ralph Ellison saw it, like they all criticized An American Dilemma for its limits, right? Like, wait a minute, how could this man provide a definition of racial equality that presumes assimilation, total erasure of Blackness? Because as he described it, and let me go back for the people listening, Myrdal said, the American dilemma is that white readers, and he doesn't say white people, feel moral tension, specifically white Northerners, white liberals, between their discriminatory treatment of Black people and their national egalitarian ideals. And that creates tension. And white readers, I'm giving you a way to solve that tension. And so he lists all the forms of anti-Black discrimination, and he prioritizes the list, the recipe for them, by saying, these are the ones that you don't care so much about. So why don't you start by addressing the ones you don't care so much about, like discrimination at work? And we'll leave for last the ones that are harder for you to let go of in your white supremacy, which is you kind of like really are protective of white women. So anything connected with sex and white women, we'll leave for last. All right, so he's trying to give them an easy way to address your problems. And by the way, this will make you look really good right now, because you have to look really good during the Second World War on the global stage. And we want to help the US get out of this situation as one of the most dominant white nations. And I start with a quotation there from An American Dilemma. He says, with all of this information, this will help you achieve this goal. He says, for perhaps several decades, the whites will still hold the lead, and America will be the most powerful white nation. So white readers, follow my prescription and you will have a win-win. You will get rid of this moral tension and you will maintain yourselves as the most dominant white nation on the global stage. Totally obvious to, I think, a lot of us who've experienced the limitations of this definition of equality. They've asked us to not speak Spanish, to like really, anything Anglo-American, that's equality. And yet it's still really dominant. The kind of pushback I got in the publication of this book, the kind of pushback to how this definition of equality has to be equality, is really still very, very strong within white liberalism. So it is obvious, but are we living in two different worlds?
Well, I think sometimes we are. Okay, I was especially struck by the very different scales at which this book works. On the one hand, it's transnational, transimperial, global history. We see this incredible movement of prescriptive ideas about how best to educate and inculcate Black folk for the maintenance of white supremacy, the Tuskegee model being exported to Africa, the exportation of social science research methods from the African survey back across the Atlantic to be applied to African Americans in Myrtle's American Dilemma, and of course, all the money that's moving around to support these initiatives. So I'd like to pause there, and you already sort of gestured at an answer to this, but I'd like to just spend a little bit more time talking about this. If you could tell us about the connective tissues between Carnegie's support of Tuskegee and its model of education, and then the turn towards social science research as the new fix, as it plays out in the three major reports you analyze: the poor white problem in South Africa, an African survey, and an American dilemma. And if I could, I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more in terms of the contents about the first two reports, the South African report and the African survey, because I think in some ways for me, especially somebody who works in African history, it felt very much like those two reports were the chapters there are scaffolding for you to get to an American dilemma. You seem less interested in, in the contents of the reports themselves. And I think that seemed especially acute to me with an African survey. And so I'm curious how, if you would explain a little bit about the connective tissues, and then maybe also just tell us for you, what were some of the things that perhaps either you found interesting or significant about the report, those two reports themselves, even as, what your investment in them is less about what the reports had to say and more about the ways in which their methodologies and this turn to social science research as this new fix are going to all come together in an American dilemma.
Okay. So the way that I see my role in the archives is network mapping. So as far as my method, I start out with the annual reports, which gives me a bird's eye. So let's just say I'll start out with the Carnegie Corporation papers. And I go from their genesis in 1911 to, I'll go beyond my time frame to the early 50s, let's say. And I look at all the annual reports, look at an overview of any change over time or continuity in the organization, then board minutes. Then I start teasing out key people. And a key person obviously is Keppel. Frederick P. Keppel is president of the organization from the 1920s to the early 40s. So why did he finance an American dilemma? Why did he commission someone to do this project? What was at stake for him? So that was a central question. And then when I said I spent, waste time to be willing to do that in the archives, go to dead ends, was to open up the papers for his funding in British Africa. So my focus is always on this network of funders, their advisors, and the projects they fund. So that's directly to your question of why perhaps some of the content, like what the, a detailed analysis of what the report said. Yes, I was leading up to an American dilemma. I'll take it. Let's take the critique. So I'm this network. So Keppel, what is he trying to do? So I'm like, oh, he wanted to finance a project after these two. And he actually mentions them in an American dilemma. So sometimes it's in plain sight, right? Like what was intended. And so I go backwards. So I go back to the moment he steps into the organization, understanding too that he inherited a certain organization. So explaining that context of Andrew Carnegie. Now, what was he trying to do? They were funding the Tuskegee model, as you mentioned, and that was a funding precedent established by Andrew Carnegie, who very much respected Booker T. Washington and put quite a bit of funds towards the Tuskegee model of education. After his passing, within this network of organizations, this was, you have the Phelps-Stokes Fund, you have the Carnegie Corporation, you have GEB, General Education Board by the Rockefellers, this whole ecosystem of funders based in New York City, who are going in sync very much in funding the Tuskegee educational model at the expense of other educational models for Black Americans. Then in the passing of Booker T. Washington, this white expert on Black education, Thomas Jesse Jones, becomes the advisor for this network of funders. Another advisor comes into the loop. Another one, and these advisors are coming out of this Phelps-Stokes fund, and they're advising the bigger foundations as well, Carnegie and Rockefeller groups. Unlike Thomas Jesse Jones, J.H. Oldham, based in London, starts finding interest in funding scientific research. And this interest is coming out of the British Colonial Office. So he's part of the missionary circles that also is having greater connections with the British Colonial Office. There's tensions there in his own community, people who say, you know, Africans should be educated the same way as Europeans. And Oldham is saying, well, no, they should be adapted to the community needs. So he finds a lot of interest in Thomas Jesse Jones' reports that he reviews in his own journal and sees value in exporting throughout British Africa, in line with the British Colonial Office's new initiatives after World War I to promote education across the continent. But aside from but as he's promoting education, he says, I also feel there's value in scientific research. And he gets the ear of Frederick P. Keppel, who's president of Carnegie Corporation, and is finding interest in funding things outside of the US because the organization he inherited in the 20s had already overburdened itself in funding in the US, but still had some funds for the British colonies. And he says, you know, Keppel, I'm really concerned about rising Black consciousness, you know, images of like Garvey and DuBois's Pan-African conferences. And we could do scientific research. Now, what is scientific research? Who knows, right? So they're like all debating, what does it mean to do scientific research? And some of the advisors in South Africa say, you know, we could really address a problem called white poverty. And Keppel says, I kind of, this is a great project, you know, it's important, it's critical. Why is it critical? For the people on the ground, white poverty is critical because it challenges white supremacy and Black subordination if there are people who are white and poor. Because economic domination requires white people to be above Black people, economically, politically, everything. And Keppel starts bringing up this topic of cooperative research. So he's very much influenced by the seeds of this new organization that we all know about, the SSRC, and their motto of collaborative research. And the people who are going to get the money say, yes, we'll do that. And they're like, what is collaborative research? What is cooperative research? Like, explain this to me, but we'll take the money. And there's anxiety over that. That model, that first study, has groups of scholars coming in from different realms, so like education, sociology. They ultimately publish a joint findings, so like a small report that's in the beginning of each volume, but they're separate volumes looking at white poverty from different lenses, united under a joint finding where these different scholars collaborated. So they're very visible as different scholars, as independent scholars and authors on the project. The second project that comes up is the project through Chatham House. Now, Keppel starts maneuvering outside of South Africa because particularly Bertram finds off-putting the rise of the National Party in South Africa. So this network values white supremacy, but a white supremacy that absorbs a certain sensibility for basically Black people's equality at some point in the long future, not disturbing anything in the moment, but verbalizing it. And unlike that, the National Party demonized in all levels Blackness, and also was privileging Afrikaner identity. And again, this organization was there as part of its mission to help an Anglo-American world. It was more invested in the British settlers than it was in Afrikaners. So they start pivoting to London as the main advisors, as the center of the British Empire. But their interest remains in Africa. And we see that too in the Chatham House conversations. So they start funding this project. Now, distinct from the first one, it's not just going to be at the scope of one geography, like one section of the British Empire. It's going to go across empires in Africa. And the problem that the people in Chatham House know, it's not about poverty amongst white settlers. The problem they see is different policies across empires on Black people. And that's a problem because if there's any instability in one white imperial power in Africa, it will affect the potential stability of other empires on the continent. So if they shared information across empires, that would help all the empires, imperial powers. So that's the African survey, the structure of it, to help inform across empires and in the process create stability. During this moment, they start questioning on the board at Carnegie Corporation the value of continuing their funding of the Tuskegee model of education. A board member stands up and says, if you think you're doing something to address the problem of Black people, and they repeatedly call it the problem of Black people, then you're not doing much at all. It's the 1930s. This model of funding was based on, a lot of Black Americans being based in the South. And now, I'm from Cleveland, as board member Newton Baker says, and I see, all these social problems I associate with Black people. And this funding practice is doing nothing about that. So let's rethink it. In this process, Keppel starts thinking about transporting this model of research from London to New York City. So it would help policymakers across governments, in this case, across US states instead of empires, share knowledge, and in the process stabilize the problem of Black people, basically. And it would reinforce white supremacy because the idea was to help white policymakers maintain their power in the process. And we could talk more about that. But in a similar model, and substantively, methodologically, it was one face to the project. So unlike the first one where it was a horizontal structure and each researcher provided a volume, the model in London was that someone with expertise in policymaking and translating research into policymaking would be the head of it. So someone with colonial administrative experience, and that was Lord Haley, Malcolm Haley. Similarly, in the US model that Keppel was transporting, it would be a Haley type. So he kept looking for someone like Haley. So someone who had policy experience, who could oversee the project, be the head of it, and have an invisible army of researchers collecting data.
Yeah, I really appreciated that aspect of the research, that you really brought that to view, and how distinct it was from this earlier, report on South Africa, and the way in which sort of this notion of collaborative research really masks a kind of unequal attribution, right, which we see reproduced in scholarship, where lots of people do work and only one or a very few people get credit for it. So I really sort of appreciated that kind of critique of these early models of collaborative research, which are collaborative but are not they don't attribute, right? Their citational practice is all wrong. So in many ways, the first part of what you said in answer to that question really answered the second part. So what I was wanting to point to was these two different scales. So, right, this transnational, trans-imperial history that you're charting, and so it's this really big book in one way, and ambitious. And on the other hand, it's this incredibly fine-grained, one might even say tedious analysis of this small group of white men, Carnegie, but to a lesser extent, but Bertram, Keppel, and those they enlist to do these projects, Oldham, Jesse Jones, Myrtle, et cetera. And, I really like those were when we're in the weeds with them, I found myself, that was the one I was most disengaged as a reader. But as a reader, I also felt that you as the historian and the author were the most energized and the most engaged in those moments. And of course, your answer just now explains precisely why that is the case, because you had to do that, you had to be in the weeds, you had to do that level of sort of tedious minutia in order to be able to, as you say, map out these kinds of networks that are ultimately responsible for producing these reports and mapping out the connective tissue. So I that's really helpful for me, and it makes me understand your investment in doing that kind of work, because I think for me, I would have found it really, really hard to sustain that level of attention to, all of the back and forth of these individual conversations that you render so, sort of clearly and in detail. But obviously, it helps me to understand, how your argument gains a certain kind of strength and persuasiveness by doing that kind of work. So I don't need to ask that question again, because you've already answered. The question was, why would you do that? Why did you spend so much time with these men and telling us so much about them? But you've persuaded me. So thank you for that. But I did just want to note, the impressive nature of the way that this book toggles back and forth between this massive global transnational transimperial history and then this really fine-grained analysis. So I do want to ask you a little bit more of a question that I'll just say up front, I think may not be fair, because in a way it's a question that basically suggests that you should have written the book that I wanted I wanted to read, and not the book that you felt was imperative. But I want to ask it anyways, because I think it's important, particularly for the audience here today, and the kinds of interests, both intellectual, scholarly, but activist as well, that we bring to the table in this community. So as we're in the weeds with these men, I found myself frequently asking, what am I not seeing? Whose voices am I not hearing? For a book that is so centrally concerned with the fate of Black people globally, Black people really only come into view in relation to the decisions that powerful white men make about them. Is there a reason you don't more fully pursue the multiple ways in which Black people globally engage with these philanthropic projects? So, and just to give but one example, in looking at early 20th century African newspapers in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, I was fascinated to see all of the ways in which Gold Coast writers were using their African-owned newspapers to write about Carnegie's efforts. And as early as 1903, I found an article in the Gold Coast Leader, which is the kind of the earliest anti-colonial newspaper in the Gold Coast, which is reporting on Carnegie's $120,000 gift to Tuskegee, right? And engaging with its particular kind of model of education. Later articles, talking about like ranking these philanthropic men and the kind of capital that they have. Even notices about Carnegie's funding Africans to study entomology in the United States. So there's a way in which, just if I take just that as a small example, and then I looked at the database more globally, and for the first 2 decades of the 20th century, I found at least over 200 articles that mentioned Carnegie in African-owned newspapers on the continent, right? So there's a way in which Black people are engaged with these projects, some who applaud them, some who are more critical, in the same way that you kind of get a diversity of opinion in the United States. And so I just sort of wondered why that doesn't kind of come out more forcefully, so we don't end up sort of only seeing Black people as being acted upon. Of course, there are a few exceptions, right? I mean, you delve more into, DuBois, Woodson, Bunch, but even like, I was thinking like with Marcus Garvey, it's almost like Garveyism appears in the book cut from whole cloth, right? There's not a sense of the history of the social ferment that is leading to this growing Black consciousness that you describe in the book, that these men are frightened by and have to figure out a way of controlling. And so I wondered if that might not have been a way of being able to, for lack of a better word, give Black folk greater agency in the story that you're telling.
Yeah. Yes. So I will cede to your critique, but I also will explain where the one that I wrote, came from. And though I still think that your project has a lot of merit, and I would love to read it. So in many ways, I'm not a white Anglo-American man, right? And but I really value studying, and I have for this long, whiteness and men, because they've so dominated so much of the academy, including in this now, dominant definition of racial equality that even though I'm not Black, as a Latina, I have been, you know, I live within the framework, right? So even applying for college, or you start understanding what white liberalism is asking of you in order to be treated equal, to gain access. And so why I study whiteness and white males specifically to, in a sense, to parochialize that domination. Like, where is it coming from? What are the different elements that lead to that domination, especially in the world of ideas? So that's where you know, my approach has been, and that's informed by critical race theory, very impacted by Derek Bell's work when I was in law school, as well as feminist work. Now, this book specifically is, in many ways, I would describe it like a love letter to DuBois, like not in a very, you know, like, what's the word? Like just platonic.
Platonic.
Yeah, like, in a platonic way. I very much respected him in the archives. And he's, again, that's the question you're asking. It's like, I'm in the archives. I am heavily based on this network. So already, who are the people that are showing up in these archives, right? Who's not even showing up in the archives? So someone who could be publishing an article in a newspaper and talking about Carnegie is not in my little world of the archives and the networks. DuBois is, and he's in the archives as someone really respected by these white Anglo-American men, but whom they also fear very much. And so who might get little grants, but never the big grants. But tracing him, he was always there. And I wanted him, it's almost a book showing him like, you were right. Everything you knew about these organizations, you knew how they were funding projects of fellowships in South Africa. You were very cordial with Keppel in your correspondence. He was cordial with you. But this is what's going on behind the scenes, as you knew. And by extension, it's also basically proof, data proof for scholars such as Oliver C. Cox and Doxy Wilkerson, Hamilton, Stokely Carmichael, Ralph Ellison. These are a lot of men, right? So like, I can be critiqued for mentioning a lot of men, and I think I'll have that self-critique for sure. It's a world of men. But it's basically saying what you knew, and here's archival evidence. Not that you needed it because you already knew, but here's all the evidence you knew, like you said about An American Dilemma. You said in American Dilemma that there, you know, the U.S. treats Black people like a colony. So there's no reason why any mention of a hypocrisy between democratic ideals and treatment is going to lead to any change. You mentioned how this definition of racial equality calls for the erasure of Blackness. Like, and yes, they did. That was not a problem for the people who funded it or wrote it. So that's where I'm coming from, that it's basically providing archival evidence in a way, and that leads to the question of self-reflection that I've had as well, which is, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know? What does it mean for me to need to provide archival evidence from the dominator's archives, right? Like the fact that I have to, why do I need that kind of proof to show what other, what people already knew? So that's a question for a lot of us in the academy. What are we doing when we say we provide knowledge, and the kind of proof that we assume we need to provide, considering the politics of knowledge in the archives themselves?
Thank you. So I just want to note to folks that they should feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature to drop your questions in. We have just a little over 10 more minutes, and I'd love to take questions from the audience. I should have started that 10 minutes ago, but it was great to listen to you. And so maybe whilst we're just waiting for some questions to come in, I might just ask you sort of one last question, which is to say, is there anything worth reprising in the example of the Carnegie, of Andrew Carnegie in particular today? I mean, I was kind of struck actually by, in some ways, not the fact of the purpose to which he put this his bunny, but the argument that, you know, he made, and you talk about it early on in the book, about the fact that, you know, filthy rich people should be compelled to give up a very large portion of their money for the quote unquote social good, right? You know, and I think today when we hear, you know, philanthropists, Warren Buffett and all these people talking about these, you know, turning over their money and all this kind of stuff, you know, it's somehow seen as new. But I don't know. I just thought, I mean, is there something about what he proposed early on that was you know, kind of radical for the time, and maybe worth an example worth returning to? Curious about your thoughts.
So something that was not radical for the time, but is radical for the times now, is the following. So in Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, he lays out why, you know, people should really not go socialist. They should not vote for the socialist candidates they hear about, like go, no, like don't vote for them. We're all good. I love capitalism in the sense of profit maximizing capitalism. It has a lot of benefits. It keeps people, you know, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. He used his own narrative, his own autobiography to show its values. So he says, don't redistribute wealth through the state, leave it in the hands of the people who created the wealth for themselves. They're the ones who are best situated to redistribute it for other people, right? So that's how he argues for the value of philanthropy versus, you know, social democracy model of wealth redistribution. What is distinct and interesting is when I see contemporary philanthropists argue about the values of capitalism, they don't acknowledge its problems in the way that Andrew Carnegie did. So Andrew Carnegie starts off by saying, I admit capitalism and profit maximizing, the way that we define it today in his time, for him and his sector of people, creates problems, you know, like poverty for some people, or like social ills of all sorts. And that is what philanthropy in a nonprofit sort of model, like separated from the for-profit maximizing capitalism, needs to address. That's what the philanthropist needs to address, the problems of capitalism. I think we've gotten to a point where that is even, you know, a novel idea for a lot of philanthropists today, who assume that capitalism doesn't create any problems. If there are any problems, you just add on more profit maximizing capitalism on top of it.
So I'm curious. So at the time, I mean, because I highlighted this part, I was like, wow, that struck me as really interesting. You said, this is on page 20 or 22. Yeah, you say, what was needed, Carnegie stressed, was for titans of industry to agree to surrender funds beyond those necessary for supporting their families' comfortable maintenance and education. So was that not like a provocative suggestion at the time? I mean, everything else that follows is not, right? This idea that the titans should figure out like what constituted their comfortable maintenance, that they should be the ones to figure out like how their surplus wealth ought to be spent, and for, you know, all those things like make sense, but the notion of like surrendering your funds beyond what you absolutely, you know, sort of determined that you needed, I don't know, I thought you know, I'm not an Americanist, but that seemed like that surprised me.
I think, okay, so one, the Americanist part, but I think two is that we're in a context right now that is even more, I would say, like unapologetic about profit maximizing and capitalism and hoarding money for oneself at the expense of anyone else. I would say this, when you say provocative, it leads me back to when you said that from a Black studies perspective, you know, much of white philanthropy is obvious. It's always the context, right? Like for different communities. And first of all, I would love to read why the book is obvious. Like I love that approach to it. But yeah, it could have been provocative for some people, but largely the context that it's read is in the times when you really, you know, you have people like Eugene Debs. There's actually a fear amongst the wealthy, such as Andrew Carnegie, that many Americans would vote for a socialist candidate in different elections. Like that was a threat. So you always had to see like, what is a threat and what are they giving up in a subtle way?
Right. No, that part makes sense. All right, from Dr. Gomez, did your findings, Dr. Morey, change how you see Herskowitz's myth of the Negro past since he wrote that in conversation with Myrtle's American Dilemma?
I have to sit on that one. So Herskowitz is a very central figure in this history as well. So he's a white Jewish scholar, at the time, very much a key advisor. He's the first person Keppel goes to when he's thinking of funding an African story-like study in the US. I will have to give that one more thought to be very fair to the question. So I'm going to take a screenshot of it on Dr. Gomez and return to it.
Actually, you know, one as we're just waiting to see if more questions come. It was interesting when I got your book, I you know, the first study that that I thought of immediately, but it's not one that you cite or engage with at all, was Noliwe Brooks's White Money, Black Power, the surprising history of African-American studies and the crisis of race in higher education. And so I was wondering, like, what, yeah, like maybe if you wanted to say more about that, like what, obviously that, you know, she's looking at, you know, the 60s forward. And so it's after this, but it seemed like such a, the relationship between foundational wealth and sort of Black studies in past and present was they were so deeply connected. And I wondered what, you know, why perhaps, you know, if there was a reason you didn't engage with that text.
No, I highly respect Dr. Rooks's book and her scholarship very much. And one, it's a different time period. So I do mention a footnote, but it's definitely not front and center. She's definitely an influence. So I focus on the first half of the 20th century, and it's an international study on funding, yes, education, and then the social sciences. I would say if we're going to put it in echo, definitely it's about white funding. Dr. Rooks talks about Black studies departments and centers in universities. The echo as well is like the spaces that this funding creates. So hopefully, you know, that detailed archival research shows the nuance, the spaces it creates as well. So I talk about Tuskegee and how even at Tuskegee, right, like in a space where the funders intended to maintain white domination, there's also Pan-Africanism, like, and dialogues. And Noliwe Rooks also talks about those spaces in the academy. So there's no reason. My second book, I have the archival research for that, is on the second half of the 20th century. And that obviously intersects a lot with Dr. Noliwe Rooks' book.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a kind of really interesting conversation that seems to be happening, you know, and I think in a lot of different quarters that is, you know, kind of excavating this relationship, you know, between sort of capital accumulation and Black life, whether it's sort of like, you know, the kind of reworkings of, you know, earlier studies, you know, by Eric Williams and CLR James, or if it's looking at, you know, Ebony and Ivory, Craig Wilder's book, not Craig Wilder, the name is escaping me, but this sort of relationship between wealth and knowledge production, whether in the you know, in the context of looking at the way that slavery funded the Ivy Leagues, or looking at the way you know, white foundations study, you know, funded Black studies, or in your case, you know, you're really, it's both, right? There's a lot of stuff about knowledge production and about education in this earlier period, but also sort of, you know, like this idea of even social scientific research and how wedded Blackness is to all of these conversations. So it seems to me that, you know, your book is just really important in terms of fleshing out one angle of, you know, of a very large topic that many people are coming at from, you from very different angles. So I think we are exactly at time. I want to thank you very much for spending the last hour with us. This was great. I really learned, a lot, and I hope, that the questions that I had coming from the particular vantage point that I think and read from really are more a sign of how much I appreciate the work that you have done in this book and the kinds of questions that it opens up for me. Books don't have to answer all of the questions that they raise either explicitly or implicitly. And I think for me, you raised both sets of questions, and I look forward to reading your next book. And I wish you all the success with Miami Institute and all of your endeavors. So thank you so much, Dr. Morey.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I really appreciate it. The questions were fantastic, and I'll follow up with Dr. Gomez's question as well. I have a piece coming out on W.E.B. DuBois as an early critical scholar of philanthropy. And I think that might be of interest too, because Herskovich, just as a final point, plays a critical role in moving funding from the Encyclopedia Project to the study that becomes an American dilemma. So there's a whole ecosystem there going on that we could talk about in a different context.
Dr. Maribel Morey, thank you so much for your contributions. This is an important work, and I'm looking forward to, subsequent conversations about this study and your new study. Yeah, and I want to thank Professor Carina E. Excellent job, and the conversation was highly generative, and I learned a lot. And I want to thank the attendees to the session, and I want to wish this webinar will be available. The recording will be available within a couple of days, and so you'll be able to access it and review it. I want to thank everyone for your participation, and I wish everyone a good day. Take care.
Thank you.